Hello. Thank you all for joining us for this panel, What Should Be in Europe's AI Legislation, as part of the Centre for Data Innovation's European AI Policy Conference. My name is Hodan Omar, and I'm a policy analyst at the Centre, and I'll be your host for today's session. Before we begin, I'd like to remind our audience that you can ask questions to the panelists in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen, as we're going to ensure that there's some time for interaction. Before I also introduce our guests, I'd like to give a quick overview of today's topic. Next year, the European Commission will consider a new legal framework to govern AI in order to address potential risks to consumer protection, product safety, and liability. The question is, what should the European Commission include in its forthcoming AI legislation to encourage the responsible development and use of AI without limiting innovation, lowering adoption, or duplicating existing rules? Here to discuss this with us today, we are delighted to have Gabriele Mazzini, who is Legal and Policy Officer at DG Connect with the European Commission, Axel Voss, who is a member of the European Parliament's EPP group, Audrey Plonk, who is the head of the Digital Economy Policy Division at the OECD, Jason Albert, who is Managing Director in Public Policy at Workday, and finally, Katharina Zweig, who is Professor for Computer Science and Head of the Algorithmic Accountability Lab at the Technical University of Kaiserslautern. Thank you all for joining us. Gabriele, can you set the scene for today's conversation by giving a quick overview of what AI regulation already exists in the EU and what issues you think needs to be addressed?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting panel. So very briefly, I think a very important point to start with is that actually at this moment we don't have any regulation on AI per se. I mean, AI as a set of technologies and techniques that are being increasingly used in our economies and societies is not per se regulated as such. At the same time, of course, there is a number of EU legal frameworks which in fact apply to those products and services where AI is used. And so, as you mentioned before, we have quite extensive regulations as regards product safety, for instance, as regards services, as regards as well the data protection, the protection of personal data. So all of this to say is that the EU legal framework is rather comprehensive. At the same time, it is also clear there are a number of risks which are emerging due to the use of these technologies. And these risks are essentially related to the safety. So when we talk about safety, we refer fundamentally to the risks that someone is being harmed in a physical sense, so life or personal integrity, but also risks that are, if you want, more immaterial in the sense they relate to what could be individual rights and freedoms. And so I would like to point out that indeed the Commission has started this work quite a few years ago. I mean, first we had the communication on the on a European approach in 2019, and or actually no, it was 2018. But the main, I would say, the most important and most recent step we took was the white paper on artificial intelligence, which led to a period of consultation. And we received a very high number of responses in terms of, to the questions of the consultation, but also a very high number of actual contributions, so thoughtful contributions to the work we did. So just to point out, as regards the issues to address, that indeed in the public consultation, there has been a very high response rate as regards the concerns for safety and fundamental rights. Actually, there were almost 80% of the respondents said that concerns to safety are either important or very important, and more than 90% actually highlighted the importance that concerns for fundamental rights are also either important or very important. So I leave it there as an introduction and happy to discuss this in more detail later.
Thank you, Gabriele. Axel, I'd like to ask you the same question. What issues do you think need to be addressed? And don't forget to unmute. You're still muted.
Sorry. So thank you for having me. And of course, what we have done in the parliament is right now to come up with some initiative reports for the Commission and then asking them in filing some legislative processes. So what we have done in the URI committee, so the Committee for Legal Affairs, we did something regarding civil liability, ethical aspects, intellectual property rights, and international law and military uses. So this is something already what we are discussing. And so now we are expecting a little bit that the Commission is coming up with these in a way that we do not focus too much on the threats on AI, also more on chances. Of course, we have to come forward in saying this should be done and this not, and so on, and that we are making these legally, for legal clarity, asking that everyone who would like to develop AI in Europe shouldn't be threatened by regulation or by the regulator. So that's why I think this is what we are doing, and we are focusing on some aspects, but we need to come up with a kind of a clear strategy also. Because I consider AI as a technology of strategic relevance. And so we can't afford not to be active here. And this is why we need this frame as soon as possible. And what we have done also to underline the importance of AI is also to come up with the special committee where we are focusing on the Commission papers, where we are focusing on some economical or sectorial approaches, and also trying to create a roadmap for EU in the digital future. So this is what we are trying to do, and the report for this special committee should come out next year, first draft probably in April. I do not know if we will come to an end also before the summertime next year, but then we might have a kind of a clear roadmap and what we would like to achieve. And what of course is, or what we are not doing so far in the best way is to having all the questions solved around investments. This is something what we need to do. You know, the recovery plan is there. We might have a lot of money on the table, but the digitalization is not in the focus of the most of the money. So that's why this I find a pity, because it's not very future orientated. We should achieve here something what might give us also a surviving aspect in the digital future.
Thank you. Axel, Gabriele, Axel says that the kind of purpose is to, or the focus is on the chances or the opportunities rather than the threats. What do you see as the kind of ultimate goal of a new framework? Is it innovation? Is it growth? Is it digital sovereignty? Or is it something else? And also don't forget to unmute.
Sorry. So I think generally speaking, these are all extremely important objectives that the Commission wants to achieve. You know, what we said in the white paper, we said we want a sort of a balanced and proportionate regulatory approach that, you know, would facilitate innovation, would facilitate global competitiveness of the EU, while at the same time making sure that you know, we address those risks that are emerging. So this is Mr. Voss is fully right in saying that we should not focus on the risks, but also on the opportunities. And this is certainly something we have very clearly in mind. And of course, you know, a legal framework per se is one tool, but it is not the only tool that the Commission has. I mean, as you may be aware, we are also started the work with the member states on developing a coordinated plan on AI, where a lot of effort is put into making sure that member states and the Commission advance on in a synchronized manner in initiatives that are not per se regulatory, but are also related to making sure that the proper ecosystem of excellence, what we call that in the white paper, is put in place. But as far as the regulatory framework is concerned, I mean, there are at least a couple of points that may be important to consider as factors that can contribute not only to, say, regulation sometimes is seen as something bad, that stifles innovation, but also to support innovation. And the advantages of the legal framework is the legal certainty, which is actually something that has been pointed out by also businesses. The trust of citizens, as I said before, there's been a high rate of response by citizens expressing certain concerns. And of course, if citizens are concerned about the use of AI, they don't know whether the rights are protected, that may have an impact on the uptake. And finally, also, a legal framework can help national authorities who are responsible for the implementation of the regulation to have the proper tools and procedures to address it in a manner that is consistent and it is uniform across the EU. So definitely, I mean, I know it's a challenge. Sometimes, regulation is seen almost as a, is our counterintuitive regulation can help innovation. But I think the two things could go together. Depends on indeed what approach is used, what regulation is put in place. And so certainly the Commission is committed to making this happen in the best possible way, taking into account of all the various factors.
Thank you. Katharina, I know you have some thoughts on this. What do you see as the ultimate goal of a new framework? And also don't forget to unmute.
And we are not doing this for the first time. So yeah, I think as a computer scientist, the most important thing for me for the new framework is to create a market in which a trustable, accountable AI system is getting the price that it needs. And I think we're seeing this effect that Gabriele just mentioned with the GDPR now. So in the Corona times, we as the universities had to choose an e-learning platform and communication channels with our students. And of course, the only software companies we would evaluate were those that were following the GDPR. So I think that actually regulation can help innovation and can help create a market in which computer scientists are paid the price for developing a better product.
Thank you. Moving on to implementation, Audrey, not all risks from AI systems are the same. Some decision-making systems pose a greater risk of harm and others are relatively benign. How do you think the EU should be approaching AI risk assessment and management so as to better foster accountability while not inhibiting innovation?
Well, thank you, Hoden, and let me thank the organizers for having me here today to talk about some of our work at the OECD. As you say, there are many different types of systems using AI, and it raises different types of policy and regulatory considerations, as well as different opportunities and challenges. For example, a water treatment plant control room where AI is operating the in and output for the chemical treatment of water versus a self-driving car versus, for example, a video recommendation engine targeted at children. These are all very different applications with different policy considerations. And so I will offer what the OECD has done in the context of our network of experts on AI as potential food for thought as the European Union goes down the path of developing an AI legislative framework. We've been using and trying to develop more user-friendly framework to help inform policymakers that need to assess these different types of systems. And the structure that I'm going to talk about in a minute is we hope to use to assess and classify systems according to their impact and related to the OECD AI principles, which include things like economic and social benefit, human rights, privacy, fairness, safety, security, risk assessment, transparency, accountability, access to research and data and technology. So really, the principles are quite broad and are generally accepted as a sort of baseline standard for how we want to implement trustworthy AI. Now, with regard to risks, we also have to think about benefits. Many of the speakers have already mentioned this. And so we think that our framework can help contextualize both of those. So just at a high level, we're working on the classification that breaks systems into 4 different dimensions. The first is context. And so in the context dimension, we look at how a system is used and what its impact is. So for example, it's what sector is it being used in, but how is it being deployed and at what scale? And to look at things like the effects on humans as a proxy for perhaps criticality of that system. The second dimension is about data and the input of data that flows into and out or into the system. Not just data in the form of rules, not just data by themselves, but also data in the form of rules codified by humans. And so this domain looks at, so you take the context and then you take the data. And then our third dimension is the technologies used in this AI model. So including the model type, the model building process, and related properties like the robustness, explainability, risk of bias. And then finally, in our fourth area, we look at tasks and output from the AI system. So we have the context, we have the data going in, we have the technology, and then we have data coming out. And that sort of, as a framework, perhaps provides a bit more of a nuanced context in how to think about the different risks and opportunities presented in how AI is applied in different ways. I know that the European Commission, through DG Info, so has been in, as well as the EC Joint Research Center, has been active in and as a participant in our work, and we hope and we appreciate that, first of all, and we hope that it will be useful in helping define and further the approach to AI risk assessment and management, as well as to accountability, while also advancing innovation, which I know is an important and core goal of the work.
Thank you. Jason, the same question to you. How should the EU be approaching AI risk assessment and management?
Well, thanks so much, Hoden, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. In the white paper that Gabriella mentioned, the EU talks about adopting a risk-based approach to AI regulation, and this makes sense, right? Because different uses of AI pose different risks. If you embed AI into a self-driving car, for example, that poses a different risk of safety than an AI that is purely, software-based. At Workday, we really think about the value of AI and ML as augmenting human decision-making, not replacing it. It's really about, making better predictions that when combined with human judgment, make better decisions. And so as you think about that, it's important to think about risk assessment in terms of the impact of the decision and the area in which it operates. And so, we are a human capital management company. And so in some areas, applying AI is an area that should face a significant amount of regulation to create trust. Something like a candidate match system for identifying which candidates have applied for a job and are the best match is something that, because of its implications on employment, should be subject to a great deal of oversight. In a way that is similar to GDPR through impact assessments and self-regulatory measures with a regulatory agency overseeing it. But there are other things, for example, in the HR context, such as our skills minor, where it can look at my resume and say, all right, Jason, you say you have a skill of public policy. You might have this closely related skill in government affairs. Would you like to add it to your profile? It's HR related, but the risks of getting it wrong or of the use of the AI are much lower. And so, we support the Commission's, a risk-based approach as they think about it in their AI white paper. But we tend to think that there shouldn't be per se rules, that each risk assessment should be done on the nature of the AI, the area in which it's applied, and the implications for the individuals in question.
Thank you. Katharina, do you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah, so certainly we do need to differentiate. So I was also a member of the Enquete Commission on Artificial Intelligence of the German Parliament. And we were quite clear about the question of when a government operates an ADM system or an AI system, so like an algorithmic decision-making system or an AI system in general, then this should be different from a private company using it. Because in most cases, we have all of the red flags that Audrey already mentioned. So we have an imbalance of power, we have a model at scale, and the state should also be a role model for all of this. And referring to Jason, yeah, I think we need to have different rules, but at least it seems that the two of you, Audrey and Jason, and also the white paper agrees on a risk analysis. And I think this is something that we need to plug in horizontally. We will talk about this later. And then it might be that actually the specific sectors in which the AI systems are used are already equipped with most of the regulation we might need.
Thank you. Gabriele, the broader legal environment already applies to AI applications, but the question of whether we need additional laws often comes up in cases where existing laws regarding responsibility or liability for decisions made by AI systems is unclear. How should policymakers be evaluating when and where additional laws are needed?
Yeah, this is I would say, the core really of one of the core questions when you set yourself to introduce new legislation. That should be based on a careful analysis of what legislation already exists and to what extent that legislation, does not cater for the needs and the specific problems that you're sort of facing as a policymaker. I mean, you're referring there specifically to the question of liability and responsibility. I wouldn't want to talk about that in detail, for the simple reason that this is not something I'm dealing on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the Commission is looking into liability questions as regards to new technologies. This is a work strand that is advancing in parallel with the work on sort of a framework on AI, but it's also dealt with somewhat separately within the Commission. As you are aware, there is already an instrument, which is the Product Liability Directive. And then tort law is primarily a national law question. So perhaps on that point, I'm sure Mr. Fox has much more to say than I can say. But so coming back to the question about sort of the gaps in new legislation, I think from our perspective, in Connected, we're looking at sort of this proposal on AI. We're mostly focused on existing safety frameworks. And so basically the safety frameworks, as we conceptualize it, are those frameworks that are intended to prevent or minimize risks before those risks materialize. Where on the other hand, when you talk about liability or responsibility in a broader sense, you're looking at those legal remedies that happen once sort of the risk has materialized. So generally in the EU, we have a broad range of product safety legislation, whether this is about, the machinery or, medical devices or grad equipment. Those pieces of legislation are put in place, over an extended period of time since, the internal market started to operate. And some of them are quite up to speed or up to date in the sense that they're more recent, like for instance, the medical device regulation, which is actually, if I'm not wrong, probably the only piece of legislation that introduces specific regulation of software. So software as a medical device. Others are less so. So for instance, if you take the machinery directive is a little bit older and, software is barely mentioned in the regulation. And so that is one aspect. And then the other aspect is indeed, so for AI that is in part of products. So that is the kind of legal framework that we have to look at and see whether that is fit for purpose. And then you have another set of AI possible uses that either are not regulated at all or are regulated with sectoral legislation that perhaps relate to the service. But if I can say, typically you don't have regulations that focus on the specifics of tools that are being increasingly used to, this is what typically AI does, to assist decision making, to manage certain processes, to lead to certain outcomes. So we have regulations that regard that processing, we have regulations that regard the provision of the service, but not regulations that specifically focuses on the software as a tool in the midst of those data processing or in the midst of those provision of services. If you want, I would say, it almost, we are going to a direction where the software per se, whether in the form of a, which is mostly provided online and so in a material way, is almost becoming a product per se. And so the question is, what we have in terms of like general principles, for instance, on equality law, or we have in forms of regulating services, what we have in terms of products, is that also suited to provide us a proper regulation of that emerging product, which is software, and that is being increasingly used in any sort of activity done by humans.
Thank you. Axel, are you able to answer the same question? How should policymakers be evaluating when and where there's need for additional laws and where existing laws are sufficient?
Yeah, so thank you. I have here some problems with the audio, so that's why thanks for repeating the question. How we will find out. So of course, all of us are somehow in a way connected to experts. They are coming to us and saying, oh, here is a problem, or this is what we should do. And then on the other side, we have the opposite and saying, oh, this might be a threat, and so on. And this is how we are approaching the situation, and then thinking about what we can do in our democracy and the procedural issue. And so this is how we came to this situation that we said, oh yes, we have to do here something on liability, something on ethical aspects, something on intellectual property rights, and something on international law. And then hoping that the Commission is taking these up and producing here something out of it. So I would say sometimes the Commission is more in the driving seat and confronting us with the problems. And sometimes we are coming with some problems, what we would like to see solved. And so on. This is how we are approaching. And then, of course, we are sitting together in small rounds of so-called shadow rapporteurs that we are then discussing these very deeply and trying to find the way forward on the one hand side, and also trying to find compromises. But this is the way how we are approaching these. Some, of course, will also be motivated by their constituencies. If there is someone already there and would like to have a kind of a discussion about these, and then after a lot of discussions, you're coming to this point and saying, oh, this seems now very important. This is something what we have to solve. Of course, if we are coming to data and AI, for instance, yes, we have done the GDPR, but the GDPR is, I would say, not really too open for an AI innovation. So we will need a lot of data for training algorithms, etc. So that's why we need a more balanced situation regarding data protection and innovation and driving innovation. And this is something what we could do, but in these times I do not have a majority for this. So I hope still on the Commission in saying to them, oh, please, if we can do a revision of the GDPR, please do not open up everything, just very specific details we can improve. And here, so on this way, we can come forward. And I hope this is what we are doing. And this should be, of course, take place more faster and more rapid and not in years' time. It's so this is why I'm getting very impatient.
Thank you, Axel. Katharina, I pose the same question to you.
Yeah, so I think what we are trying to do in the next 10 years is to transfer 1,000-year time of experience with human decision makers onto AI. And for human decision makers, we have a lot of rules, actually. So a judge needs to have a specific education. If they want to go to the highest court, they need to have a specific grade or a specific age. A nurse can do other things than a doctor because of the education. And I think what is working well at the moment is this idea that we need to transfer all of these thousands of years of experience with human decision makers to AI. What I'm missing, and I think that would help us to identify the lacks more clearly, is to better understand where decisions made by AI are fundamentally different from human decisions. And I suspect that there are the more important gaps in our legislation. And this is really something that I would wish to see more in the European European Union to find out where are the main differences between AI and human decision makers, and where do we need to accommodate for that.
Thank you. As we're talking about approaches, Jason, some countries like the United States favor sector-specific policy frameworks, whereas rules like those imposed by the GDPR are economy-wide. What do you see as the benefits and costs of a sector-specific approach to AI regulation in the EU?
So it's a great question, right? We see this most fundamentally in privacy, where we have a bunch of very sector-specific privacy laws in the US, but we don't have a general law like GDPR. And that creates sort of an interesting situation where, you know, the US has more privacy protection probably than it gets credit for, but it ends up being very hard for consumers and others to understand what protections apply. You know, there is probably some need for sector-specific AI regulation where there's existing sectoral legislation. When we talk about, you know, safety, we talk about, you know, self-driving cars. We have a lot of legislation about automobiles that applies equally to autos that are you know, have AI embedded in them. But from a practical perspective, to have effective regulation, you know, we think that a broad approach rather than a sector-specific approach like GDPR is the way to go. You know, so you have baseline protections that people can understand, that takes a risk-based approach so that it allows for variation across different sectors, whether AI is embedded in a product, whether it's a standalone software application, whether it's something else. And then, you know, fundamentally, you know, from our perspective, what's important is creating a framework for AI governance and process, right? GDPR does this really well with data protection impact assessments. We should have an obligation for companies that, you know, develop AI to do AI impact assessments, to be able to, you know, understand and be able to explain to folks, like, how is this AI going to impact decisions, how it's going to impact individuals. We should have transparency requirements so people have some understanding of how the AI works and what it does. And again, you know, have those done through self-assessment, have a regulator that can go in and examine it in case of complaints or concerns, but something that's flexible and that can work across different industries.
Thank you. Audrey, are there examples of non-regulatory approaches, such as voluntary consensus standards developed by the private sector to manage the risks associated with AI applications that could be more adaptable to the demands of a kind of rapidly evolving technology?
Yes, thank you. The OECD has been working actively on tools to implement trustworthy AI. our goal is to identify practical guidance and shared approaches across OECD countries, but also beyond, that can help policymakers and other actors sort of assess what's appropriate for their context based on the experiences of others. This work provides a structure to organize and then assess the implementation of AI policies. And so we have a few ways that we break this down. The first is in process-oriented tools. This includes places where there are labeling schemes, risk management approaches, other documented frameworks that really focus on the process. I think some of the other speakers alluded to these kinds of approaches. The second area is technical tools. So this is tools being, for example, developed by standard bodies or technology companies to target specific AI-related concerns like bias detection or explainability. And the goal there is to provide a look at the actual output as opposed to just the process. And then on the education, we have education and awareness building tools that are really focused on making users and potentially policymakers or others aware of when AI is being used and being deployed. And so I think we see all three of those being implemented in different ways by different organizations. And so I think, we'd like to see, obviously, from an OECD perspective, more information to build the evidence base on how these are being deployed, how they're being used, so we can help assess, what's effective and what's not, as we try to help guide policymakers into taking our AI principles and making them actionable in legislation or broad frameworks. We expect with that framework I just mentioned, tools, education, and process, we expect to finalize that and publish it early 2021.
Thank you. Katharina, how do you think the EU's framework should account for considerations of bias or discrimination?
Yeah, that's of course the hardest and maybe most interesting question, because we tried as computer scientists to understand what discrimination actually means from a legal perspective. So I think we have three different uses of this word, of this term at the moment, and this makes it very difficult to understand what is going on. So we have the day-to-day meaning of everything that is slightly unfair to any one group could be discrimination. We have the legal perspective. And in computer science, it's very easy for us. We have 24 different measures to quantify fairness, which of course is a joke, right? So each of them incorporates some ideology, some view on fairness. So let me give you an example. In Germany, we have child support money from the government, and there are two ideologies about this. Either you do it in a distributive manner where every parent gets the same amount for their children, or you do it in a counterbalancing manner where you try to help those parents the most that have the lowest income. And you can see that these fairness approaches are not compatible. Either you choose the one or the other. And we have 24 different mathematical equations to measure fairness. And I think society actually has 100 different ways of measuring fairness. And what is put into laws is just a tiny fraction of either. And so understanding how to regulate that is actually, I think, will be an interesting academic project for the next 10 years. And I'm wishing good luck to all the lawmakers in the EU trying to turn it into laws.
Yes. Axel, do you have any thoughts on this?
So thank you, Katharina, for this wonderful idea. So it is very hard to find definitions and so on. So everyone is coming not only from the member state side, also from the political party groups. They have their own ideas on this. So it is hard, and probably we are ending up in a kind of a compromise at the end. Nothing really is fitting, a very good idea at the end. But sometimes I'm also of the opinion that some sectorial approaches should be done by themselves. So self-regulatory might be very, very helpful. So I'm claiming all the time, be your own legislator. So if the problem is coming to us, then we can't guarantee for any for a certain output. And so this is why sometimes probably you get a better approach outside the legislator, but then you need to come up with something what has also what includes the whole sector and might be scrutinized also by the commission or by the legislator in a way, and so that we might come up also with some democratic elements in it. So not leaving the self-regulator then alone. But this is an approach. This is a approach on this because the changement of the rapid development in all these is not meeting a very slow democratic procedure. So that's why we have to think about probably different procedures for a legislator, or we should come up in saying, oh, there should be a self-regulation in place, scrutinized in a way, and then we can continue. But what the Commission has done at first in this term in saying, oh, probably because of face recognition, we should do kind of a moratorium for 2 years and so on. I would say this is not the right approach for legislator. We know already what's right and what's wrong, and therefore we can give some guidelines and coming later with the details, but sending out the signal, please move on, develop, be innovative. But if you're respecting these guidelines, then you won't get any trouble. But then we are coming later on with a kind of a more detailed regulation, and so this might be a way forward. Probably there are other ideas, but I see that we are not acting in a way so far how we should come forward to be or to survive in a digital world where we have these big regions in the world and we are in the sandwich position here. And that's why we need to do here something, because the European Union is already very complicated in this legal structure and procedures. So we don't have one language, one legal structure, one mentality, one tradition. We are splitting up, but we now need to come forward if we would like to compete still.
Thank you, Jason. One of the conversations that comes up around bias and discrimination often is we hear increased calls for algorithmic transparency and disclosure to enable non-experts to understand how an AI application is working or making a certain decision. But mandating transparency that requires organizations to share details about their models can often hamper their incentive to develop these models. How do you think the EU should balance this trade-off of transparency, but also kind of incentivizing companies to innovate?
I mean, it's a great question, right? Transparency is critical. I mean, again, to draw an analogy to the privacy space, we have privacy statements under GDPR. You have an obligation to tell individuals, what data is being collected, what purposes is this going to be used, how is it going to be shared. I think, equally in the AI space, it's important to have transparency. And you think about it, right? There actually are sort of two parties in the AI space. There's the party that develops the AI technology, and then there's the party that actually deploys it. And they may be the same, but they may not be the same, right? Oftentimes, one party will develop AI and sell it to another who will deploy it or use it with their own data. And so, each of them should have an obligation to talk about, how the AI is used, what elements go in, what type of data is used to power it, what types of decisions or inferences are being drawn. I think there's a way of doing it without having to provide proprietary information or trade secret information or algorithms. An algorithm itself is very uninteresting and unuseful in terms of transparency. And again, we have a good body of experience to draw on from privacy and other areas in fashioning this.
Thank you. Katharina, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a myth that needs to be debunked. So if done correctly, there is no company that will need to share secrets with anyone, but maybe a close group of experts that have a working ethic that would not let out anything of this. And as Jason already said, it's also a myth that we just, as computer science, just need to see millions of lines of codes and know immediately what it does. So it's actually not that very helpful either. And I think there are ways that can be transferred from other sectors to get into this, but only if it's necessary. So we should not underestimate the costs that we inflict on a company if it needs to provide transparency, accountability mechanisms. So this needs to be balanced with the risk that the usage of this algorithm bears. And again, so what I really think is we need to create a market in which this extra effort is being paid for, where we as a society want it and need it.
Thank you. Gabriella, do you think the EU and its member states have the resources to monitor and enforce the proposed AI framework, given the additional expertise it would entail?
Yes, thanks for the question. This is certainly something we are closely monitoring and looking into. Of course, this is key. I mean, we just don't want to put some laws on papers that no one is able to implement. And the experience of the GDPR is certainly important, an important model to look at. On the other hand, we have to, when we talk about the regulation for AI, we have to think that, as I mentioned at the beginning, AI is something that in most cases will actually be part of existing products or be part of sectors that are already regulated and where there are already authorities. So I think an important consideration that here where we keep in mind is the fact that in terms of governance and in terms of new powers or new structures, we have to be aware that those in the member states and including at EU level, there are already a number of structures that take care, so to say, of certain sectors or certain areas. So to the extent those areas are automated or they see increased form of sophisticated automation, then it wouldn't make a priori sense to sort of create additional structures, but rather use the structures that are there. Typically, EU law is implemented by the member states, so it should be up to the member states to have this role of making sure what are the authorities that are mostly suited for that role. And that's one part of the question. So concerning the authorities that should be sort of in charge of implementing whatever new rules are put in place. On the other hand, there is the question indeed of knowledge, of know-how, of expertise. And this is also, something that, we have to be realistic about in the sense that already now, probably there are not so many companies who also make use of very sophisticated forms of AI, partly also because, we lack perhaps the sufficient workforce, sufficient persons that actually can develop and deploy those systems. And perhaps those people are considered in certain companies rather than others. So, of course, public administrations also may struggle in having the competences to make sure that they have the knowledge to implement the regulation. So I was mentioning before, the coordinated plan on AI and sort of additional actions that you can take to support not just setting the purpose of, setting the rules, but also making sure that there is an architecture, there's a framework in place that the rules can be implemented. And so for instance, the network of testing experimentation facilities, the digital innovation hubs, So those, I would say, if I may say, sometimes less sexy topics that are discussed in the EU, in Brussels or the EU conversations are as important as discussions about what should be high risk AI, what should not be high risk AI, what should be the criterion. I mean, these of course are key. But what I'm trying to say is that the Commission is actively also thinking about those more hidden components of the work that actually are key for a successful implementation of the regulation. And those actually, we are thinking of those, and those are not necessarily talked about, but we are aware that there is a question of just of setting the perfect rule, but also making sure that that rule can be implemented.
Thank you. Audrey, a big focus of the EU strategy thus far has been on increasing trust and public perception of AI. How much of a priority do you think this should be compared to other important areas such as accuracy?
Got the unmute button. Thanks for the question. I think it's hard to say. They're all very important areas. And so I think, ideally, we're not having to trade off and say, we work on one at the exclusion of others. They really all need to work together. That's why the principles, the OECD recommendation principles that were adopted last year by the OECD member countries, but then also by 7 other adherent countries, and then used also by the G20, you have to think of them together as a package. And I think advancing as much collectively together as possible is in our collective best interest.
Thank you. Jason, the same question to you.
Yeah, I think it is in a way a little bit of a false dichotomy. I think that, it's important to have both accuracy and trust, and accuracy, however defined, and it depends on the purpose of the AI system as to what accuracy means, is an essential element of trust. But, at the end of the day, we have to understand that people won't use technology that they don't trust. So to realize the benefits of AI for society, it's important to establish a baseline of trust. And, part of that is having regulation, because in a world without regulation, people will wonder how their data is used and what protections they have. So that's why regulation is an essential, building block for trust. And, it accords with everything else, right? Technology is not this inexorable force that acts on society. Society ultimately determines how technology is used. It's been true throughout the history of technological developments and throughout the history of computer science. And it's no different here. So I think, both are important. I think accuracy helps play into trust. And I think trust with a foundation of regulation is essential for society to realize fully the benefits of AI and machine learning.
Thanks, Jason. Axel, kind of springboarding off what Jason said, a lot of international companies, especially American ones, operate in the EU. How do you think that this new framework will impact the export of goods and services?
So we are always looking for kind of a level playing field. So it's not only regarding European companies, it's also all the companies who are delivering their services to the European market. And therefore, we would like to have this level playing field for all of them. And that's why I would say we need to think, and as long as we are sitting here and trying to come up with some regulations, we also do have we have to approach the whole idea also from a competitive side. So that's why I would say the regulation, it's necessary, but we need this very fast. That we do not lose too much time, and also the other companies are doing what we can do here. So that's this is something we need to improve the whole framework for European companies. It's not only the infrastructure, it's investment, it's about everything, skills and so on. And so that's why I think we need to speed up, and because we are already in a way left behind. So if we would like to survive in a digital world, we need to be stronger and faster and so on. And for services who are coming from the outside of the EU, we have to make sure that they are meeting all the same framework. And so that, for instance, what we have done in the GDPR is also that this is not only valid for European companies, this is also valid for everyone coming from the outside, like the big tech companies. They have also to introduce this GDPR to their services. And then they can offer also here on our market something what they have in mind.
Thanks, Axel. Since you said speed up, I'm going to take one of the audience questions now, and it's about time, and it's for you, Gabriele. What is the timing for the regulation? Can you give us an approximate date?
Yes, so I'm going to speak much more into my microphone. I was told my voice was very low, so hopefully this is better. Yeah, that's very quick. It's scheduled for the first quarter of 2021.
Thank you. Another audience question was directed to you, Katharina. And it's related to something you said earlier, do you perhaps have an example as to where AI decides very differently than a human decision maker?
So it's almost Christmas, right? So let me give you an example from the Bible. Do you remember the story about King Solomon, who should decide who is the mother of the baby? He did something totally extraordinary. Yeah? He took the child and threatened to cut it in half so that every mother would have half of it. So for me, this is an example of what AI could never do, to step out of the normal process it was trained in and take into account different, very human emotions into decision making. Of course, this is an extraordinary situation. So in most cases, we wouldn't need it, that a judge or somebody would step out of a context. But I think we've all been there. Yeah, we get lists of procedures and questions that we should ask in sequence, for example, to hire a person. And then we have this person in front of us and her CV is totally different. And then, of course, you step out from the procedure that was prescribed. And so this is something only humans can do. On the other hand, in Austria, we see a system that is used to classify unemployed people to better understand whom to help with further education. And in that example, I was wondering why the system used only 9 variables. And they told me that this is because of statistics, otherwise our groups would be too small. So the AI system can only use 9 variables. And I thought that was a big disadvantage. But the developer of the system told me that actually humans in 90% of the situations would only look at 2 variables. So what we see here is that, of course, computers have advantages and humans have advantages. And we need to better understand which one is used best to have the best outcome. And I'm also very curious about something that Axel Voss just said, and I'm not so sure whether it's not a myth as well, that we are left behind in the digital market, because we really need to understand that code is fixing cultural values if it's about decisions about humans. And so this is our market. We need specific software here that cannot be built anywhere else in the world. So if we make this market strong, if we make it a single market, if we have rules that enable us to get the price for the software we actually want, then we are not behind. We're just in front of a very interesting future.
Jason, I know you have something to add.
Yeah, I think I just want to, say I think Katharina makes a very good point here, right? From our perspective, again, at Workday, we think about AI and ML as making better predictions, which when combined with human judgment lead to better decisions. And I think that just falls with the example, right? The AI can look at, 9 factors, whereas humans look at only 2. And so it can make much better predictions. But at the same time, you have to have that human judgment and oversight, as in, the example with King Solomon. And so I think as we think about AI regulation, as we think about the types of, impact statements and transparency, human oversight and the role of human oversight is going to be critical there.
Thank you. Axel, do you have a reaction?
Yes, please. I'm just wondering, so it's not all about, so I would more say in this digital world, it's all about ideas and fast reaction and turning this into a kind of a business model and so on. So if we are having here only ideas and then waiting on the legislator, this can't be the right way forward. And this is what I mean. So that the idea then might be gone and someone else is then doing this and creating a kind of a new monopoly. This is a new idea. And we're then sitting there like what we have done with the search engine and saying, oh, now they created a very good one, so it's not necessary any longer to do this in a way. But there I would say we need to be more innovative here, and our mentality is in a way so that we are saying, oh, what is the legal frame for it? But we are coming to a situation where we might say there's no legal frame here, but I have to innovate and I have to invest right now, otherwise other will do it. So if our mentality is not changing, then I can't see really see a progress on development in the European Union if we are not able in reacting faster as a legislator.
Thanks. Audrey, do you have something to add to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to both Katarina and Jason's points about human in the loop and prediction versus decision. I think we talk a lot about the systems deciding, and it might be helpful for us to talk about the systems predicting and humans deciding, or deciding how to then make decisions on those predictions. Meaning, do we automate that decision? Do we let a machine decide, or does a human come in at that point? And so I think it's important to break some of these concepts into finer steps, because otherwise it feels a bit like a deluge of, Return of the Robots or zombies or whatever. And in fact, we have choices that we can make. And those choices can be embodied in policy or legislation or in codes of conduct or ethical standards about how and when we're going to let certain actions be taken and by whom. And I think that's the place where I think, as Jason has mentioned, laws, policies, standards can go to enhancing a more trustworthy environment with the goal of enabling the development of economies and societies for the purposes of overall advancement. So anyway, I leave you with that.
Thank you. Gabriele, do you think there's a need to create a new body to govern and implement the AI framework, or will extending and repurposing existing bodies that already have an AI portfolio be enough?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, most likely the Commission, of course, on this hasn't fully materialized its final decision. So this is more, my own personal view on this. But indeed, it looks like there are already a number of existing authorities that are taking care of some aspects of regulations that affect AI, whether it's GDPR or whether it's financial services or whether it's products. So in principle, it seems it may be possible to adopt new rules and at the same time making sure that existing authorities have additional powers or competencies to address also the implementation of those rules. That being said, there still may be a need for some sort of we could say, supranational or at EU level framework for cooperation between the authorities of the member states. But in principle, it seems like for the reason that you also mentioned, indeed, we don't, there are already a number of regulations in place, already a number of authorities in place. So as long as this is done in a way that is smart enough to make sure that there is also coordination, because that's the issue. It is totally true that the AI that may be used in a sector or with a specific application is not necessarily the same as an AI that used in another application, or that may give rise, this is often said, to different type of risks. And so people were mentioned before about the specific context in which AI use, and this is also certainly true. On the other hand, it's also true that however we define AI, we are dealing with a sort of common characteristics of this technology, whether it's about the transparency, what is about the black box, what is about the human oversight, which also keep emerging in all of these sectors. And so certainly there is a need to take account of the specificity of the sector, but on the other hand, it's also important to make sure that those specificities are taken into account within a common logic, I would say. And so what would be the best structure to do that? I think it's still to be discussed, but it seems a priori difficult to say that all existing authorities should not play a role.
Thank you. Katharina, did you have something you wanted to add on this?
Yeah, I think that is something that Gabriele Mazzini just touched. So it's not only about us, the developers of software and the operators of AI systems, but if I create an expensive product that is more trustworthy and my competitor does not, but is not sued, and there is no judges and there's no fast reaction on this, then the market is destroyed. So I think it's really important that we have courts that have computer science expertise, and this will be very, very interesting to get, because at the moment the salaries paid by courts are not anywhere near what you can earn in industry. So we really need to think about how to get the expertise into courts, into something like the TÜV or any other institutions. And I think that is the third part, to create a trustworthy market, to have the developers create trustworthy AI systems, to have the operators that buy them, and then to ensure that everyone is compliant.
Thank you so much. One thing we haven't talked much about that I'd like to touch on is access to the data that we're using to train these AI models. What, if any, legislation on increasing access to data and models for AI do you think should be included in the new framework? And I'll pose that first to you, Axel.
Thank you. You're totally right. Data is the fundament of everything what is digital. So that's why we have to come forward with the access and sharing and analyzing of data. And so therefore, I'm very much appreciating now the submitted proposal for the Data Governance Act. And here we are having some ideas where we might end up in some intermediaries. It seems complicated, but it might be a good way forward. We have still to discuss. But then once again, we should think of all options, how we can get more data. So if this is public data, if this is personal data also, and if we're thinking about on a European health data space, also to combine the criteria for GDPR in a way that we can also create some innovation in the health sector. And so we alone as a member state, you do not have enough data probably. So we have to gather from throughout the EU the data, and then we might compete with other regions in the world. But here, once again, we have to enable these. And this, I would say, is the best way forward.
Thanks. Jason, do you have any thoughts on this?
I largely agree with Axel, right? I think it's important that, particularly public data sets are made available and, to train, because you just need tremendous amounts of data to train AI algorithms. And, it's hard, as Axel puts out, for any individual country to do it. It's hard for any individual company to gather that. And particularly when we're talking about areas like, bias and discrimination, in particular, having data sets that people can use to help in terms of testing and refining AI applications in with respect to those types of risks, I think is really important. And so we're pleased that the Commission has thought about this in its framework programs around both data access, data governance, and AI regulation. And then the other point I would make is that to the extent that governments or the public sector make data sets available, it's important that they be available to all on equal terms. If you have preferential access for particular groups, that could potentially limit innovation. So again, broadly agree we need broad data sets that people can access in order to drive innovation in this area.
Thank you. Audrey, several EU member states have already started work on establishing their own national frameworks on ethics and AI in parallel to the EU initiatives, and they're likely to enact further kind of rules on AI that perhaps might be divergent. What areas of key focus at the EU-wide level do you think need to be kind of implemented to ensure fragmentation doesn't hamper a kind of pan-European AI approach?
Thanks for that. I know we're short on time, but I think, not to harp back to the principles too much, but I think that they do provide a foundation upon which we can coalesce around the core pillars that we need in legislation and policy. Of course, within those principles, there is, there's some possibility for divergence, but I also think that's why we are working with OECD members that are also EU members, but also with the EU to gather data from EU member states about their approaches so that we can both map them to the principles and show areas of commonality. So I think, using those value-based principles, of which there are 5 as a foundation, will help already to harmonize, and we see a lot of positive activity in that direction. So I would just encourage that to
Thank
continue.
you. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Katharina, do you have a last thing to add to that?
Yeah, I think that what we see so far is very abstract, and what we really need to do on the national and the European levels is to get from principles to practice. And I'm very much looking forward to the next 10 years because I really want to be an active part of that.
Thank you so much. We just have 1 minute left. So I think we have time for one more comment. So Axel, I'm going to let you get in one final comment.
No, thanks a lot. I'm very encouraged by our discussion here, and thanks a lot also to be part of it. What Katharina says the latest was, yes, I totally agree that we would like to be a part of it, but still having in mind also surviving in a digital future for Europe. This means also acting and reacting and so on, and means also building the right frame on it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to everyone watching. Next up, we have a keynote, so stay tuned. Thanks very much.